seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the wind.
The Declaration of Independence. Most Americans have heard about, or perhaps have even been coerced into studying the Declaration while in school. But anecdotally, it seems to me that most of the people I encounter who talk about the document don't really seem to know much about it. Or worse, they think they know all about it, all that it entails and all that it means, but demonstrate neither an understanding of the philosophy behind it, nor the actual wording in the documents, nor events that led to it. So in that light, I thought I would tackle it, in order to try to posit my take on it, detail some of the actions that led up to it, and list some of the philosophical consequences related to it. The long process by which the Declaration came about, and as such the history of the Union and independence itself, begins in practical earnest when the first British colonists traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to settle on the new, fertile, and wild continent which would later be called North America. The Spanish, Dutch, French, Portuguese all had an interest in colonizing the titular New World, and most of the aforementioned countries beat the British to the shores by a long shot. When the Brits began moving across the sea to follow in the footsteps of other European powers, they initially found hard times and difficulty eking out a living. Thanks to the help of the native populations who had been living there for tens of thousands of years, and the colonists' own tenacity, eventually flourishing populations began to emerge on the American coast. Many of the people who braved the journey across the ocean on wind-driven wooden ships on a trip that could last 4 months were groups of staunchly religious people who, finding themselves in the minority in their homelands and subject to the legal transgressions by their native governments, fled, looking for space and freedom to practice their religion in whatever way they wanted, without having to force fealty to the Anglican Church or any government office attached to it. However, and as mentioned in the Declaration itself, many of those people still thought they retained the rights of Englishmen, and made the journey under the presupposition that all the rights of their forefathers had fought for and retained, from the Magna Carta in 1215, to the Petition of Rights in 1628, to the English Bill of Rights enumerated in 1689, should still apply to them. They made the journey assuming that this was to be the perpetual state of things, that no matter what happened to them and their families, they would still retain the rights afforded to them by a long and bloody history which saw their ancestors fight for and then presumably guarantee the same rights as their British kinfolk. That as members and chartered participants in the British Empire, they would retain all the rights that the English monarchy and Parliament granted to all British citizens, regardless of the proximal location of the ground on which they were standing. From the early days of colonization, unto the 7 Years' War, or in America known colloquially as the French and Indian Wars, those rights were assumed to be in place, and neither the Crown nor Parliament did much of anything to obfuscate or strip away those rights and concerns. After the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, all that quickly changed. The war was long and brutal, and ended up being a costly victory for the Brits. The English and the colonies under their protection fought the French and many of their native tribal allies for supremacy of the northern, central, and southern portions of North America, and they won. The French negotiated peace with the Brits, and for their trouble, the Brits took control of the Quebec province, and a large portion of land descending south from that province along the eastern side of the Mississippi, all the way down to modern Florida. The war put the Crown and Empire into debt, and thinking that since it was partially for the benefit of the colonies should do their part to repay it. The colonists, who likewise fought in the war and expunged their own fortunes to see it through, agreed. The Crown had for the most part left the colonies alone, and while the Brits technically had taxes and excises on the books for 100 years, having found it hard to collect in the colonies, they mostly just left them all alone. After the war, though, and due to the need to repay the huge mountain of debt winning it had thrust upon the Empire, King George III and Parliament began adding new taxes and collections and laws to the books that the colonies had no input in creating or implementing. In addition, the Crown kept large standing armies and created a plethora of new offices in order to force the colonies into paying the debt on the Empire's specific terms. The colonials were not too happy with this new change in policy. Though they saw that the debt had accumulated was troublesome, and agreed that some of it was the colonies' responsibility to pay back, they resented the methodology and tactics employed to squeeze it out of them. They had also fought in the war, many volunteering their own lives, services, goods, and fortunes to winning it, and felt it unfair that Parliament and the King set the terms of payment squarely on their heads. Each colony had offered to send their own militias into battle, but the Brits refused to let anyone but their own organized officers control the fighting and payments, commenting that the colonials were backwoods, uncultured, and uncivilized farmers and miscreants. The colonists took this as an extreme lack of respect, but complied anyway, as they thought it was their duty to do as the Crown instructed. However, after the humiliation of being told by the Brits that they were not good enough to lead men, yet they were enlisted in some commission to fight anyway, a divide between the aristocratic Brits and the meritocratic Americans began to grow. After the war, a number of parliamentary acts and royal edicts were thrust upon the colonies, with no input from the colonies themselves, that made matters much worse. The Sugar Act of 1764, which forced the colonies to only deal with British merchants and to pay a fee on every bit of sugar sold or traded within the colonies, and the Stamp Act of 1765, which forced colonials to pay a fee on pretty much every ledger, parchment, published pamphlet, newspaper, accounting, lading or bill, or virtually anything you wrote something down on and signed, had a fee suddenly attached to it, further humiliated and enraged some of the more radical colonials. When they began ignoring the taxes outright and refusing to comply when territorial governments or British officers tried to force payments, Parliament put through the Townshend Acts, which put a duty paid to the Brits on every exchange of mercantile goods from overseas. The colonies were perplexed as to why the Empire had all of a sudden begun putting taxes and revenue levies on their livelihoods without representation, when for the previous century the Brits had mostly left the American economy alone to grow and flourish. After each revenue-raising act or decree had been put upon the Americans had rejected meaning or refused to pay. The Brits put forth acts which allowed standing armies to roam the countryside to impel collection. Nominally, the Brits said the armies were there to protect the western borders of the colonies, from attacks from other European powers still on the continent, and native tribes who still occasionally raided those frontiers. It became quickly apparent that the protection excuse couldn't hold water. As the armies on the frontier did nothing but spend money, which was added to the debt the Brits were forcing the colonies to pay, or move inland and assisted tax collectors with compulsory collections. To facilitate this movement of armies, the Brits passed the Quartering Act, which allowed army officers to take control of, dwell and bunk-house their troops in any vacant buildings in any colonial city, town, or homestead, and forced the communities there to feed and clothe all of them, frequently without compensation to the communities that were being invaded. The colonies resisted these acts, that they thought were tyrannical, by petitioning the local governments to redress grievances, then Parliament and the King's Court, all of which fell on deaf ears. Finally, the Americans figured that the only way of forcing someone to pay attention to their complaints was to boycott any and all British goods, merchants, and services. The few legislative bodies that had heard and dealt with the colonials' complaints, such as the House of Burgess in Virginia, found themselves dissolved by orders of Crown-affiliated governments, military officers, or the King himself, should any sympathy to the colonials be shown in them. While a partial boycott took a large chunk out of the money going back to Britain, it did not yet force Parliament or the King to listen to the colonies' complaints. After the town of Boston, which was particularly aggrieved by the revenue-raising taxes and compelled acts, began ignoring all of them wholesale and resorted to smuggling goods so as to stay outside the Brits' oversight, Parliament reacted harshly and violently. They sent warships to blockade Boston Harbor and began seizing ships to make sure that their excise taxes and fees were paid, and to put an end to the smuggling which was cutting them out of the economy. Bostonians reacted violently themselves and began rioting and passing their own decrees condemning the Brits as tyrants and usurpers. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, where redcoat soldiers fired into a crowd of unruly Bostonians who were incensed at the occupation, killing 5, tensions initially began to come to a head. War appeared to be imminent, but the sentiment quickly cooled off with a new Act of Parliament which repealed most of the Townshend Acts, and gave some small manner of economic autonomy back to the colonial governments. Some of the revenue acts still remained, as did the enforcement of the ban on smuggling, and of course the famous Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Shortly after, the whole issue came to a full head with the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, and the war had properly begun. Though many local magistrates in the colonies had been taken over or dissolved by royal decree or parliamentary order, liberty-minded colonists, such as men who would eventually be known as the Founders, did what they could with their limited options to maneuver by setting up their own legislatures and trying to get Parliament and King George to listen to their complaints. They were occasionally partially successful, as Parliament removed all but the Tea Act after the Boston Massacre. However, Parliament soon passed the Coercive Acts, which were known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, because the acts were viewed as nothing more than punishment for the colony's resistance to previous revenue and quartering attempts. These acts punished the entire city of Boston, in reaction to the actions of a few among the Sons of Liberty who held the Boston Tea Party, with a harbor blockade, more property seizures, and conscription into the British Maritime Service. The acts also took direct control of the colonial government and gave it to the Crown's magistrates, who were then permitted to arrest and try anyone they suspected of crimes against the Crown, either by a judge paid by the Empire rather than trial by jury, as jury trials were supposed to be guaranteed as per the British Bill of Rights in 1689, and in many cases required that the trials be held far outside the local municipality where the supposed crime had been committed. The colonists resented that they were no longer being given what they thought was their inalienable right to a trial by their local peers, and especially incensed that they had to leave the colony to go to Nova Scotia, or England itself, just to be railroaded by judges who always ruled in favor of the government. Lastly, a new Quartering Act, which increased the British military's powers by allowing them to take over and occupy, without compensation, any building or house or plot of land they wished. In response, the colonials called their own aggregate legislature into being, in the form of the First Continental Congress in 1774, to once again petition the king and parliament for a redress of grievances, and if none were to be had, to set up a mercantile boycott of all British goods. 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives, and they in general unison decided on a course of action. The business of the legislature was not to push towards revolt or independence, but to force the Brits into coming to the table with the colonies. And recognizing what the colonies determined were their natural rights of self-determination, no taxation without representation, among others. The Congress also had an eye to plan on reconciliation should the intolerable acts in the moratorium on expanding settlements and the hard-won western frontiers, which the Brits forbade, despite the colonies and Brits winning the previous French and Indian wars, which Congress thought was theirs to settle by right of victory. They wanted to establish a permanent legislature which would work with the king and parliament and allow locals to pass laws and tax their constituents by local consent, so parliament could no longer thrust taxes or laws without the direct or representative consent of the governed. The boycott push was generally successful, as every colony adhered to it and refused to allow the Brits to do business. But Parliament ignored or repudiated everything else the First Continental Congress put forth towards reconciliation. At the close of the congressional session, they agreed to meet again at a Second Continental Congress in 1 year, if their aims and goals had not been met or at least redressed by the Brits. After Congress closed sessions, the Revolutionary War broke out in Massachusetts, and as a result of increased British hostility and harbor blockades, and when the Second Continental Congress convened the following year in 1775, there were some new orders of business to attend to, particularly after King George declared that the colonies were not only no longer under the protection of the Crown, but were now considered hostile and in armed conflict with the whole empire. The goal of the First Congress was to reconcile with Great Britain under better terms for the colonists, but unpopular opinion in the colonies had slowly and incrementally began to turn towards full-scale independence by the time the Second Congress was convened. Not every representative was on board with the full-scale revolt yet, so Congress took quite a while to get there. In addition, many representatives were under direct or strict orders from their constituency not to vote for independence without permission. Initially, the Second Continental Congress made clear the justification for armed resistance to British actions and edicts, but presented the possibility for reconciliation with the Olive Branch petition, which, like most everything else the colonials sent to Parliament, was completely ignored. After another year, when no headway had been made on the reconciliation angle, and when the public at large saw that reconciliation was not a likely outcome, the Second Continental Congress finally got around to independence. Richard Henry Lee proposed a resolution on June 7, 1776, to declare independence from the Brits, and officially sever all ties from the Empire. His proposal seems more a practical result than explicitly a revolutionary one. The Congress knew they had best get their acts together if they were going to come out of this dire situation with anything to show for it. Massachusetts was in open rebellion against the Brits, and battles had already commenced and people had already been killed on both sides for it. Lee argued that independence was the only way to go, and that a declaration needed to be made formally and legally, or else no other worldly power would recognize their struggle, and even considering offering them aid. Still, despite the open hostility between the colonies and the Brits, not every delegate was on board, so the vote to declare independence was put off till some specific work could be done setting up the groundwork and legal format to facilitate it. A committee of 5 was called to write up the declaration, consisting of 5 delegates from the colonies. Specifically, James Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston were tasked with writing the requested declaration, which would legally sever ties from the Brits and give other world powers the evidence they would need to consider the states free and independent, and perhaps then render them aid when it was requested. The leader of the committee, John Adams, tapped Thomas Jefferson, a newly arrived replacement delegate from Virginia, to write up the first draft. Jefferson wrote it in 3 weeks, primarily writing in a room he had rented from a bricklayer named Joseph Graff, who had a comfortable boarding house just outside Philadelphia, the city where the Second Continental Congress was convened. Jefferson set about his task, writing the Declaration, where he justified the separation from the Empire, set up the internal philosophy of the right of revolution among other natural and inalienable rights, using philosophy garnered from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, among others. After 3 weeks he was done, and he submitted it to the committee for review. The committee liked the first draft, but they still wanted to make a few changes before submitting it to the full legislative body. After some minor changes and redactions, it was submitted to the full body, and more changes were made, primarily in the list of grievances, which was edited so that while the original draft contained a list of 24 complaints, the final list contained 27, despite the removal of Jefferson's repudiation of slavery, an accusation that the edict and practice of slavery was thrust upon the Americans by the Crown, and culture the Americans inherited. Likewise, the Continental Congress removed portions of Jefferson's condemnation of the British people in the second-to-last paragraph. Nominally, the complaint about slavery was removed so as not to alienate some of the British politicians who had taken the colony's side against Parliament and the Crown, by repudiating them and their culture specifically for so egregious a crime, as was Americans inheriting the system of slavery from the parent society. Also, to placate some of the southern colonies, and get them to sign the document, because Georgia and South Carolina were still pro-slavery colonies, and the founders wanted unanimous consent among the colonies and legislature to revolt, because they knew life would go on afterwards and figured it would be a good idea to try to retain the UK as a trading partner. The finalized document was on the table, and now all that was required was the vote to pass it or to reject it as part of Lee's resolution. The final vote happened on July 2, 1776, with Delaware receiving its third delegate, which broke the stalemate its remaining 2 delegates created when one voted to adopt Lee's resolution and one voted against it. South Carolina changed their vote with the removal of all mention of slavery, and Pennsylvania delegates changed their vote to yes to adopt the resolution, and with that all but New York had agreed to adopt the resolution and declare independence. New York's delegates assured Congress that they were personally behind the resolution, as was their constituency, but they were under strict orders not to vote until they received word from their home state to authorize it, so they once again abstained. Though with Delaware and Pennsylvania and South Carolina voting in favor of the resolution, 12 of the 13 states approved it, and the vote was carried to declare independence officially. Word came from the New York legislature a few days later, and they in turn voted for the resolution, and by July 4, 1776, unanimous consent of the colonies was assured, and the declaration ultimately declared. Here is the final text of the declaration that was sent to each colony, foreign governments, and finally to Britain. In Congress, July 4, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem the most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable than the right themselves by abolishing the forms of which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably of the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be attained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for the purposes obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, and for the amount of payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of, and superior to, the civil power. he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any of the murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offences, for abolishing the free system of English laws in the neighbouring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous of ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare and undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our good intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The declaration itself came in 5 parts. The introduction, which explains to the world at large why the document was written. The preamble, which quotes Locke's second treatise of government almost verbatim, and which explains the philosophy behind the need to declare independence, and broadly how the new American government would come about. A list of grievances, and an indictment against King George III in regard to that list. The denunciation of the British people for ignoring the colonists' pleas and reminders, and of a shared legacy of justice and liberty, which the colonists thought the British mainlanders ignored. And finally, the conclusion, where all of the above was codified and made clear as a statement of intentions towards American state sovereignty. After the Declaration was voted on and sent, it was read aloud in most of the cities in the newly independent states, and eventually all around the world. Once Americans' intention and concern moved on to the actual revolt itself, the Declaration seemed to be seldom thought about or talked about, and faded from memory from all but the most resolute patriots. Even through the presidencies of some of the men who wrote it and voted on it, like Adams and Jefferson. Only matters of the day went out, and the Declaration was rarely talked about or even recalled. That made a comeback about 80 years later, when Lincoln frequently referenced it, and in particular the preamble, when talking about the political and cultural matters of his day, prior to and during the American Civil War. He noted that the founders were talking about liberty and natural rights, derived from nature itself, as applied to us all. The concern with individual liberty and individual people as reflected in the preamble in order to tackle the issues that were threatening to dissolve the Union entirely. He noted that the founders knew slavery was an issue, and that it was a glaring hole in the Declaration with all its talk of freedom and rights, noting that the founders knew it was an issue, but since they had bigger fish to fry, delayed the problem till some later day, as they had the task of revolting and creating a new functioning government based on those ideas of liberty and self-determination, and that it had to be kicked down to future generations to deal with what the fathers did not have time or the will to get to. From Lincoln's time, the Declaration was frequently cited inside America and out, when talking about liberty and how individuals ought to be free. It was cited in many other countries and nations' own Declaration of Rights, and in many of their constitutions and other legal philosophy. It continues today to be cited frequently by liberty-minded people and societies, and spawned itself new forms of political philosophy as to how to achieve the lofty aims and goals it proposes, ought to be the foundation of any free people. As such, it is one of the most important and impactful documents ever written, and it still continues to directly shape our world and thoughts to this day. The founders knew that they were signing a one-way ticket to freedom and self-determination or death, and that once they made that decision, they had to stick to it without wavering because the consequences for failure would cause them to be forevermore labeled traitors and put them in the hangman's noose. So, we too should take their acts and sacrifice seriously, because the consequences for failing to make sure they stay at the forefront of our society are almost as dire. We should give the document Philosophy, Consequences, and Sacrifices Made by Those Who Toiled, Bled, Suffered, and Died to Make It a Reality credit and consideration. We must think carefully about what they did and what they said, so we can honor it, and them, and the ideas that made all of us the beneficiaries of liberty and freedom. So we can notice, just as they did, that certain responsibilities come with freedom, and that self-determination has nested within it the duty to perpetuate those ideas and acts, and give it to our progeny, just as our ancestors gave it to us. We cannot allow it to be forgotten. We cannot let the tenets of liberty, freedom, self-determination, natural rights, and sacrifice fade or become tarnished. We must remember them all, and we must persevere. So personal sovereignty, rather than tyranny, remains at the core of all that we do, say, and think, and that our descendants know, love, and cherish freedom as much as we do, and as much as our ancestors did.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.